Number 4. Hashima Island, Japan. Hashima Island can be found 9 miles out from Nagasaki in Japan. At one point, the island was the most densely populated place on Earth, but now it's abandoned and it has its fair share of dark secrets in its history. The island is only 16 acres, and until the 19th century, Hashima Island wasn't really considered for human habitation. However, in the early 1800s, the discovery of coal under the island and in its surrounding waters eventually led to the perception of the island changing. The island was readily bought up in 1890 by the Mitsubishi Corporation as Japan tried to catch up with the rest of the developing world during the latter stages of the Industrial Revolution. The island was rapidly developed by the Mitsubishi Corporation, both to support this new mining operation as well as the workers and their families who moved to live there. At first, you may think that living on a remote island would be a hard pill to swallow, and you would be right. However, Mitsubishi did everything in their power to make moving to Hashima Island as enticing as possible. The accommodation provided was in the form of high-rise apartments, which, although small, offered the very latest technologies and comforts, including electrical appliances like TVs, air conditioning, fresh running water from the mainland, and many others. The workers and their families weren't without things to do on the island either, as there was a cinema, school, bathhouse, sports facilities, and even a hospital. Every piece of space was used, as children played in playgrounds on the rooftops surrounded by vegetable gardens and even Olympic-sized swimming pools. Residents of Hashima Island enjoyed an abundance of modern conveniences, and remarkably, their entire monthly electricity bill amounted to just 1 yen, making these comforts exceptionally affordable. Word quickly spread to others how good life was on the island, and soon the island was full to the brim with inhabitants. At its peak, the island was populated by more than 5,000 people, which, when you consider that it only spanned across 16 acres, is a lot of people for such a small place. In fact, it made it the most densely populated place in the world at that time, and the poster child for Japan's industrialization and modernization efforts. However, at the advent of World War II, the image of a worker's paradise was soon shattered, as Japan went to war with its neighbors, China and Korea. Prisoners of war and civilians were shipped off to Hashima Island as forced laborers. The conditions for these workers were a lot different than those of their Japanese predecessors, and they certainly didn't enjoy the same luxuries. The conditions were brutal and inhumane, and anyone who refused to work would be ritually beaten and humiliated by the guards. It's no wonder that the prisoners and forced laborers kept on Hashima Island ended up giving it a new name, referring to the place as Jail Island or Hell Island. Over the war years, at least 2,000 people died working here, either through backbreaking work, unsafe living and working conditions, malnutrition, or sheer exhaustion. Some of them even tried to escape by swimming to freedom. However, this didn't work, and many of them either drowned trying to make it to shore, or were captured and brought back to be either heavily punished or killed. Others chose to take their own lives to get away from the daily torture and debasement. Throughout the mining operation at Hashima Island, over 15.7 million tons of coal were extracted from sources up to 3,280 feet below the ground. But by the 1970s, Hashima Island had started to outgrow its usefulness. The coal reserves were starting to run out, and the mining of it was far more expensive than the alternative of petroleum. One by one, the mines on the island started to close, and with them went the workers. By 1974, Hashima Island was fully abandoned, with no one left to inhabit the once state-of-the-art high-rises and community spaces. Instead, it was left to be reclaimed by the elements, falling into ruin for over 30 years. This was until 2009, when Japan put in a bid for Hashima Island to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, thanks to its major contribution to the country's industrial development. However, this was a contentious move, as South Korea objected to the island being given this status, as there was no acknowledgement from Japan about their war crimes and the atrocities that had happened there against Korean and Chinese nationals. The argument went on for 6 years, until Japan finally agreed to admit to the mistreatment and forced labor that took place there. After this, the island was open to the public, allowing anyone to be able to tour the decaying ruins of what once was the pinnacle of Japanese industrial prowess and also a place of great shame. What sort of emotions do you think you would experience if you visited Hashima Island? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 3. Roosevelt Island, New York. Roosevelt Island is now known as a local landmark of New York City, although many may not know about its dark past as a place of oppression and incarceration for some of the most needy and helpless in society. The city of New York purchased the island, which sits in the East River, in 1828, and 4 years later, a penitentiary was built there. Blackwell's Island, as it was known then, was the perfect place for a prison, making sure that those incarcerated there were far removed from the mainland and the rapidly developing city. But as time went on, Blackwell's Island became home to more than just criminals and seemed to turn into a dumping ground for anyone not fit for society at the time. Workhouses were opened on the island, essentially a form of forced labor for those who were too poor to be able to sustain themselves or who had declared bankruptcy. Almshouses for the most needy were also established by charitable patrons, and 3 different hospitals were also constructed on the island. One general hospital, a smallpox hospital to deal and contain contagious outbreaks of the disease, as well as another hospital for incurables. At the time, the term incurables referred to anyone with a condition that was considered unlikely to be cured. In this case, many mentally and physically disabled people found themselves placed on Blackwell's Island. And because of the sheer amount of institutions on Blackwell's Island, many New Yorkers referred to it as Welfare Island. The mentally ill also found themselves being locked away on Blackwell's Island very early on in the city's ownership of it. In 1839, 7 years after the penitentiary had been built, the New York City Lunatic Asylum was founded there, and the very first one in the city's history. Conditions for those living in the asylum on Blackwell's Island were far from humane. This was documented by investigative journalist Nellie Bly, who went undercover as a mentally ill patient at the New York Lunatic Asylum in the late 1880s. By this time, all of the men at the asylum had been transferred out to a new facility on Ward Island. But the all-women asylum was still desperately overcrowded. Bly described the treatment that the women faced, including ice-cold baths, spoiled and rotten food, filthy conditions, and even physical abuse from the caretakers. Based on her experiences at the asylum on Blackwell's Island, Nellie Bly wrote a book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, in 1887. The book caused shock and uproar, and as a result, asylums like the one on Blackwell's Island were forced to review their care and offer more humane treatment to their patients. At the start of the 20th century, the remaining inpatients in the asylum were moved out to other hospitals around New York City. The building itself was taken over by the Metropolitan Hospital, and the island fully adopted its nickname, becoming officially recognized as Welfare Island in 1921. Almost 35 years later, the Metropolitan Hospital moved out of the building, and the institutions on Welfare Island fell into ruin. In the following years, wind, rain, and even fire left what was there almost unrecognizable. Today, the only way to know whether the asylum where such mistreatment took place even existed is to look for the octagonal tower, the only piece of it left standing. The island underwent yet another name change in 1973, albeit this time it was a positive one. It is now known as Roosevelt Island, in honor of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who lived with polio throughout his life. This new name demonstrates the things that people with disabilities are capable of, instead of shunning them away from society as shown in the island's past. Number 2. Varosha, Cyprus. Varosha in Cyprus was once considered to be the Las Vegas of the Eastern Mediterranean, a playground for the rich and famous. It was the place to be for Europe's elite when they chose to go on vacation. Luxury cars graced the roads. There were streets of designer outlets and pristine hotels lined the waterfront. However, everything would change in the summer of 1974. Just as many people would have been getting ready to sit back and enjoy their vacation at the resort, the Turkish armed forces invaded the island and they occupied Varosha. The reason for this was the long-running tension between Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, an argument in which Turkey eventually intervened. The island became split between north and south, with the north occupied by Turkish Cypriots and the south by the Greeks. Due to its location, Varosha was caught right in the middle, becoming a heavily militarized no-man's land. Everyone in Varosha was forced to flee their homes, leaving everything behind. As barbed wire fences went up, cutting Varosha off from the outside world, the luxury and decadence that the resort embodied began to fall into decay. Rusting sports cars sat unmoving on the streets, and impressive building facades began to crumble. Perfectly kept and manicured gardens started to become overgrown by shrubs and cacti. Instead of going to retake Varosha and other towns caught up in the conflict, it was much more feasible to just let things stay as they'd become to avoid risking further war that could engulf the entire island rather than just a portion of it. Instead of holiday goers, the only people frequenting Varosha now were the Turkish military patrols. Anyone who was even curious about what was going on there would be met with police fines and military whistles to deter them from even taking photographs of it. The state of Varosha was unknown until 2017, when a stretch of beach near the resort was open to the public. However, not just anyone could visit this beach. Only those with Turkish citizenship or of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or the TRNC, were allowed to visit. This caused a public outcry, with many civil activists calling the entire situation with Varosha a shame for humanity and comparing the opening of the beach to only Turkish nationals as being akin to the apartheid in South Africa. In the upcoming years, TNRC authorities and the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, announced plans to make Varosha more accessible through a regeneration project. This initiative, aimed at restoring the resort to its former glory, might incur costs in the tens of billions of euros. In 2021, Erdogan even announced that under a trial period, 3.5% of Varosha's area would be open to the public and officially declared TRNC territory. This meant that people could now enter Varosha itself and were able to see the full extent of what it had become. However, most people refused to enter through the military checkpoints due to the still heated debates on the city's ownership. And as a result, many of the visitors to Varosha are actually from the neighboring TNRC city of Famagusta, who use the area for bike rides and exercise. There's a big stumbling block in the way when it comes to the future of Varosha, despite Turkey and the TNRC's plans to bring it back as a resort destination. As of now, the TNRC isn't considered a legitimate state on the international stage, and many of the building and property rights are still contested by their original owners, many of whom still have belongings being held hostage in their former homes. Therefore, any decision to open up Varosha again is considered not only illegal, but would also be directly going against the UN Security Council. And at number 1, Presidio Modelo, Cuba. Off the coast of Cuba, on the remote island of Isla de la Juventud, lies what was referred to as a model prison. Presidio Modelo features 5 circular cell blocks inspired by the concept of panopticon, as articulated by French philosopher Michel Foucault in his seminal work Crime and Punishment. This architectural design instills a perpetual sense of being under observation among the incarcerated individuals. This was achieved by having all the cell blocks laid out in a formation that would then allow guard towers placed in between them to have a full view of what was going on inside. The prison was commissioned by then-President of Cuba, Gerardo Machado, in 1926. Presidio Modelo was used to house prisoners who were found guilty of all types of crimes, from murderers all the way to political enemies of the state. In fact, Fidel Castro was incarcerated there for 2 years after being involved in the attack on the Montada barracks. But the prison was far from a model institution. Only designed to hold 2,500 prisoners, Presidio Modelo often held more than double that number, as was the case when Castro was there. During his stay, there were over 5,000 men packed inside the prison. The cramped conditions have been likened to a battery chicken farm, with the men simply packed into cells that were full to the bursting. With far too many prisoners, general conditions were poor. There was no running water and the floor was covered in garbage. The smell of human excrement was rife in the air, and the food was poor in quality as well as in supply. This led to countless hunger strikes, violence, and rioting amongst the prisoners. Ironically, the conditions in Presidio Modelo got even worse when Fidel Castro came into power in 1959. Despite knowing just how horrible the conditions were at the prison, anyone who spoke out against his rulership over the country found themselves with a one-way ticket to the prison. Eventually, the prison buckled under the strain of the massive overcrowding and riots, becoming unfit for purpose. It was finally shut down in 1967, and all of the prisoners were shipped off to the mainland for incarceration there instead. Today, Presidio Modelo lies abandoned, although you can visit it if you want to venture off the beaten tourist path. Visitors are free to explore these massive structures, even scaling broken staircases and walking through now eerily empty cells. Which one of these abandoned places creeped you out the most? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.